can also lead us to stigmatize and dehumanize groups, because you don't kill if you're a soldier unless you're being patriotic on behalf of the tribe. And they feel like they're under threat, and that's why they're doing it. We have to change that. We won't change it with rational arguments like the type I'm talking about. We will change it through literature, through stories like 1,000 Sisters, through art, like Congo last night, through film, through music. These mechanisms appeal to our deepest nature, the part of our brain that's emotional and not just quote-unquote reason. We now know that intelligence, rationality, and emotion are integrated. And so we have to appeal to the whole person when making these arguments for change, to remind people that the scientific insight that we're all one species is true on a personal level. It takes a lot of effort, but I would encourage you to add that to your consideration of what to do in activism. So remember the prompt sucker that I provided to the bird and the elderly black neighbor as a kid. It's an example of how at every moment of life, the choices you make a difference. You can either choose to be engaged, work on these issues, to care or not. And I know you care, but I know that it's going to take an extraordinary effort to try to change the situation. It's about corporate responsibility, in other words, but it's also about personal responsibility. You can make a change. You have made a change. Keep it up. Thank you. Do we have some time for questions?
Is there a question? Yeah.
A few minutes, okay.
We don't have the microphone because
I'm using it. I'll repeat the question.
We'll just speak up.
Ben?
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the role or promise of the business community or the legal community in engagement and living this.
That's a great question. The question is about the role of the Congolese government and how we can more effectively engage with either government or business. And there are precedents. This is another example in your activism. You may want to consider doing things like Statoil of Norway did in Venezuela, training the judges. We have about 306 million in overseas development assistance to the Congo right now. And it's being used to basically react to the problem. There's not enough of a proactive investment in the basic infrastructure. The country has no rule of law. Joseph Kabila, the president, David mentioned, changes the Constitution, so he's more likely to get reelected. It's going, in a sense, the wrong direction in that regard. And so businesses, diplomats have to come together to insist on basic normal infrastructure, an independent judiciary, rule of law. And then they can use carrots and sticks. They can say, we will invest in roads that'll help us get our products to market, and we'll invest in women's empowerment programs, so they can work with government. But they have to be realistic about it, because I think that, Kabila is he's iffy. He says certain things to the international community, and he does some things that benefit him, as his father did, as Mobutu did before him. That's just, that's the recent history, and it won't change unless we really take cognizance and try new creative things. Yes?
Thank you very much for your talk, but I'd like to challenge your claim that businesses are good actors.
Please speak up. You want to challenge my thing about businesses as good actors?
Yes.
All right, I agree. We're all bad. I forget.
I think that my point is not, I think the way that I look at it is, I think the question is not whether there can be good or bad businesses, but I think the question is more about whether the way that businesses are structured these days can be a problem in themselves. For instance, I think that way, under the current global capital system, the way that business is structured is that it allows a very small group of people, by no other merit than the fact that they own assets, a huge amount of assets and capital, to make very powerful decisions that impact the rest of us. And that to me is really problematic. For instance, let's just give an example in the US. It talks about oil drilling. That decision, just an example. The decisions that go behind that occurs a lot more, say, in the boardroom of a BP than it would, go through maybe like a meeting room that I would go to.
That's
Even
a
though
good
that
question.
decision equally affects, all of us. And nor does it go through the employees who actually hold BP, who actually face probably tremendous, safety hazards. So I think that, I think the problem is that when you have this kind of structure, it generates perpetual asymmetric power relationships. Right? The very fact that a small group of people, not only that they control these big decisions, but they can also lobby the government. All the politicians in some ways love to talk to business leaders. And they can also buy out media. And we know that, our media is not really, is controlled by a small group of, 5 or 6 huge companies. So I think that, to me, this conflict in Congo, along with many, many other conflicts in the world, is intrinsically tied to the way that we structure our economy, which does not fundamentally embrace democratic principles. Because we allow a small group of people to make all these decisions. So I think if we do not challenge that, as long as we have this kind of structure, this kind of conflict will continue to happen. And all I can do as a concerned citizen is to play this catch-up game, right? You have board members sitting at BP, they'll make phone calls, blah, blah, blah. And all I can do is on a weekend, I come here with this leaflet. And that's not enough.
So what would you do? Let me just read, for those that couldn't hear the question, try to capture the essence of it. And then I'd like to ask you what you do to change it. But the question was about whether businesses are inherently, in Joel Bacon's phrase, pathological. He had a book called The Corporation, which was made into a fabulous documentary in, I think, 2006. And he actually compared the qualities of the corporation with the World Health Organization's descriptions of a pathological individual. And he found corporations are greedy, don't care about others. In other words, they were totally pathological. And there is something to be said for that. But he makes a mistake, and I'm hesitant to criticize Joel because he's a distinguished Rhodes Scholar, Canadian law professor. He says that this is required by law. In my investigation over the last few years, and I'm teaching Stanford students the opposite, that it's not a requirement in law to have focus only on short-term shareholder value of the corporation. In fact, not only are the systems around the world more stakeholder-oriented, so sometimes they formally include workers, as in the German system, but certainly the stakeholder values of Africa, throughout Africa, even China, a few years ago, expressly when it amended its corporate law, it said corporations have corporate social responsibility. It endorsed a stakeholder view as well as attention to shareholders. The UK just amended its law not only to permit but to require directors to take into account impact on the community and environment. In other words, it's not a legal requirement. To the extent you're right, and I do agree that it's all about power, you need countervailing power. And that's why the commitments of corporations to human rights are so important. And why the best corporations recognize that is essential to them having sustainable, productive, successful markets in this day and age. Because the world is different. It used to be the case that Cecil Rhodes' Royal Africa Company could brand slaves, with the Duke of York's signature, DY, or the logo of the company. That would not work today. And thank heavens, we're beyond that. And yet, a conflict like the Congo, which has the same sorts of atrocities, can happen because it's off of the radar screen. Yes, you can have an NGO there with a satellite phone that'll bring it up, and so if a corporation's directly involved in complicity, it can have a bad impact. But if they're removed by several tiers, or we've heard about how complex the supply chain is, many tiers of suppliers, they can still say, we have nothing to do with it. That's why I think rather than condemn corporations as inherently bad actors the way Joel Bacon did, we need to encourage this movement of encouraging their commitments to human rights, and then they're translating those human rights to policies and procedures within the corporations. And then, remember I did say, we still need those hard law mechanisms. For the corporations that still don't get it in reform, we need to have them subject to lawsuits and even to criminal actions, by the International Criminal Court, by national authorities. And that's the sort of legal regime we need. It's got to be a mix.
The financial crisis makes you very pessimistic. Even in a country like the U.S., the whole, rule of law, supposedly a democratic government, there is very little we can do for corporations who are in this extremely powerful, monopolistic, position. And it's kind of hard to expect that they would in other places outside of the U.S.
Let me ask my question to you then. What would you do? I mean, is the solution violent revolution?
Obviously.
Obviously.